Imagine standing in the suffocating dust of a fallen empire, holding a fragmented piece of clay that rewrites the end of the world. In the 8th century BCE, across 5 distinct ancient cities of Mesopotamia, a strange obsession took hold. The Babylonians were meticulously copying a single, terrifying text. They did not just store these accounts in the shadowy depths of their temple libraries. They inscribed its verses onto amulets, wearing the fired clay directly against their skin for centuries. Why does a civilization forge armor out of a god's confession? For thousands of lines across countless other tablets, the Anunnaki were absolute, commanding forces that could reshape planets and dictate the rise of empires without a trace of fear. Yet this specific text held something entirely different. It carried the quiet, devastating admission of the most powerful entity in the Babylonian cosmos, acknowledging his own slow, irreversible decay. Before we step further into the fading light of Babylon to decipher this ancient resignation, make sure to subscribe to Cryptic Realm. We are about to unearth the records of a vanishing pantheon. What happens when the architects of creation realize their divine machinery is rusting? And more unsettling still, why did their final written testament assure us that after the heavens fell silent, humanity would be the only ones left standing in the ruins? Listen to the wind sweeping across the desolate, sun-baked plains of modern-day Iraq. Beneath the shifting sands lies a fundamental misunderstanding of the ancient world. When we think of deities today, we imagine abstract concepts, invisible forces dwelling in an ethereal heaven, detached from the dirt and the grit of human existence. But to the ancient Mesopotamians, the gods were not metaphors. They were not distant. They had physical addresses. They walked upon the earth. They required sustenance. They felt the passage of time, and they resided in towering architectural marvels that functioned less like modern churches and more like fortified palatial estates. The most magnificent of these was the Esagila, the towering temple complex in the heart of Babylon. Its name translates to the temple whose top is lofty. It was the cosmic anchor, the literal center of the universe for the Babylonian Empire. Deep within its labyrinthine corridors, shielded from the blinding desert sun by walls of mud brick and fragrant cedar imported from distant mountains, sat the supreme authority of the known world. This was the domain of Marduk. Who was Marduk? In the grand creation epic, the Enuma Elish, he is the conqueror of chaos. He is the entity who allegedly organized the chaotic debris of the solar system, who split the primordial waters to form the heavens and the earth. He was absolute, unquestioned, the sovereign architect of reality. To stand in his presence was to stand before the furnace of creation. Yet, the era epic, that strange and terrifying text worn upon the skin of the Babylonians, brings us into the shadows of the Esagila for a conversation that defies everything we thought we knew about ancient theology. In this shadowed sanctum, Marduk is approached by Era, the volatile god of plague and indiscriminate destruction. Era is restless. He wants to unleash his catastrophic weapons upon the earth, to burn the righteous and the wicked alike, just as he once did. But to do so, he must speak with the supreme architect. What happens when the god of creation meets the god of annihilation in the dark? You would expect a clash of wills, a display of infinite cosmic might. Instead, Marduk offers a confession that chills the blood. He tells Era that his divine garments have deteriorated. To the modern mind, this sounds completely mundane, a god needing a new wardrobe. But this is where the limitations of modern language blind us to the terror of the ancient text. We must step away from the poetry and look at the physical reality of the Babylonian worldview. In the ancient Sumerian and Akkadian languages, this concept was known as the Melamu. The Melamu was not woven fabric. It was not a cape or a crown of gold. It was the physical, luminous substance of a god's power. It was an aura, a tangible, radiating force field of absolute authority. It was described in ancient texts as something physically visible, an overwhelming, terrifying brilliance that emanated from the bodies of the gods. Think of it not as clothing, but as a biological or energetic radiation. When a human being came into direct, unprotected contact with the Melamu, their nervous system would short-circuit. They did not bow out of respect. They collapsed involuntarily, thrown to the ground by the sheer kinetic pressure of a superior entity. The Melamu was the undeniable physical proof that you were standing before a being fundamentally different from a mortal. It was the impenetrable barrier between the Creator and the created. And now, sitting in the heart of the greatest empire on earth, the Supreme God admits that his Melamu is degrading. The radiation is fading. The cosmic armor is rusting from the inside out. He is losing the very substance that makes him a god. Why does he not simply fix it? If he organized the solar system, surely he can repair his own aura. This is where the confession deepens into a profound existential dread. Marduk tells the god of plague that he cannot restore his Melamu. He possesses the knowledge, perhaps, but the act of reigniting that cosmic forge would trigger a catastrophe far worse than the deterioration itself. He is trapped. He is a prisoner of his own fading magnitude, paralyzed by the fear that attempting to save himself will fracture the very foundation of the world he built. Consider the weight of that realization. Imagine a being of absolute supremacy staring at his own hands, watching the light flicker and dim, knowing that to fight the dying of the light would only bring down the universe in flames. It is not a story of a god who is angry. It is a document of a god who is quietly, inevitably fading away. He is accepting his own slow extinction without drama, as if the end has already been written. But the most unsettling question remains unanswered in the shadows of the Esagila. Why was the Melamu deteriorating in the first place? What could possibly drain the absolute power of the supreme architect? The answer, inscribed on those clay tablets, is not a tale of cosmic betrayal or a grand war in the heavens. The truth is far more humiliating, and it redefines the entire relationship between the divine and the mortal. The power of the gods did not fail because they were defeated by a greater force. It failed because of something entirely tethered to the fragile, fleeting lives of the very creatures they engineered. What is absolute power if it starves in the absence of the powerless? We are conditioned by millennia of modern theology to believe that divinity is self-sustaining, that a creator exists entirely independent of its creation, requiring nothing but obedience and reverence. But as we stand in the suffocating shadows of the Esagila, breathing in the phantom scent of ancient myrrh and listening to the echoes of Marduk's confession. A far more terrifying architecture of reality begins to reveal itself. Marduk, the organizer of the cosmos, the supreme entity who shaped the solar system, explains to the volatile god Era exactly why his divine garments, his melamu, cannot be restored. The answer is not a tale of cosmic betrayal, a war in the heavens, or some dark metaphysical curse. It is a labor problem. This is the detail that stops the breath in your throat, a truth so grounded in the mundane that it becomes infinitely more horrifying. The physical substance of a god's power, the radiating aura that forced mortals to their knees, was entirely dependent on specialized human craftsmen who operated deep within the Esagila temple. These were not high priests chanting incantations in the abstract. They were human maintenance workers. Let that reality settle over you for a moment. The most powerful being in the Babylonian cosmos required mortal mechanics to keep his power functional. To understand the sheer magnitude of this vulnerability, we have to look horizontally at how the ancient Mesopotamian world actually functioned, looking past the myths into the dirt and sweat of their daily economy. A temple in Babylon was not a quiet place of weekend reflection. It was a massive, pulsing industrial engine. It was an economic powerhouse that consumed vast amounts of grain, livestock, precious metals, and, most importantly, human physical exertion. There were guilds of elite artisans, the Umanu, goldsmiths, carpenters, weavers, and stonecutters, whose entire existence was dedicated to the physical upkeep of the gods' earthly estates. They built the grand statues, they forged the golden overlay, they wove the intricate, literal garments that adorned the idols, and through some lost mechanics of ancient ritual and physical labor, they maintained the very conduit of the Melamu. The gods provided the blueprint of civilization, but humanity provided the physical fuel. It was an engineered symbiosis. But what happens to a machine when the mechanics vanish? Marduk admits the unthinkable. His specialized workers had been scattered. History tells us of the endless, grinding wars of the Mesopotamian plains, the shifting of violent empires, the Assyrian conquests, and the devastating famines that routinely broke the back of the workforce. When cities burned and populations fled into the deserts, the temples grew silent. The cause of their scattering matters less than the catastrophic result it triggered in the heavens. Without those specific human craftsmen performing specific human labor, the physical substance of his divine power could not be renewed. When the humans stopped working, the divine power simply stopped. The absolute sovereign of the world was describing a state of complete paralysis. We must not read this with the modern habit of turning ancient anxieties into poetry. This was not mythology functioning as a clever metaphor for spiritual distance. The Babylonians recorded this as a literal, physical breakdown of the cosmic order. The gods' power had degraded, and because the human hands that polished the gears of the universe were gone, that power could never come back. Imagine the creeping dread of a Babylonian scribe etching those words into wet clay. Imagine the existential vertigo of realizing that the immortal beings in the sky were slowly dying of neglect. It completely flips the narrative of human insignificance. We were told by older ancient texts that humans were created to serve, designed to bear the yoke of the gods so the divine could rest. But the Era epic reveals the fatal flaw in that ancient design. By outsourcing the maintenance of their own power to a fragile biological species, the Anunnaki tethered their immortality to human logistics. They built a grand, cosmic life support system and handed the controls to creatures made of dust, water, and fleeting lifespans. When human civilization fractured under the weight of time, war, and disease, the supply lines to the gods were severed. The Melamu flickered, the divine radiation cooled, the great architects of the heavens found themselves trapped in decaying avatars, unable to act, unable to reignite the forge because the human workers were no longer there to strike the anvil. They were starving, not for food, but for the kinetic energy of human labor. And so, it forces us to ask a deeply unsettling question. Were we truly just expendable slaves in a cosmic hierarchy, or were we the living batteries powering an empire that did not belong to us? And if the gods were paralyzed without us, what does that make humanity? We were the fragile, short-lived mechanisms holding the universe together, and when we dropped our tools, the gods began to die. The paralysis of a supreme creator does not invite a peaceful silence across the cosmos. Rather, it creates a terrifying vacuum, a dark and expanding void where the sheer gravity of uncontrolled forces begins to awaken. While Marduk, the sovereign architect, sits trapped in the suffocating shadows of the Esagila temple, watching his luminous Melamu decay into nothingness, another entity stirs in the dark. The Era epic does not merely document the tragic fading of the world's organizer. It opens with a chilling counter-narrative by introducing a different god named Era, the ancient deity of plague and violent destruction who has been lying dormant. But Era is not alone in his slumber. Tethered to his command is an arsenal unlike anything recorded in the annals of human mythology. His weapons, 7 personified beings, have been still for a long time. Too long. The text identifies them as champions without peer, and each one is systematically assigned a different, absolute form of catastrophic destruction. Flood, fire, famine, disease, and the sword. We are accustomed to reading these descriptions and filing them neatly away into the comfortable category of poetic allegory. We look at the ancient world through the condescending lens of modernity, assuming that when early humans spoke of disease or flood, they simply invented angry spirits to explain the random cruelty of nature. But to read the Era epic with that arrogant assumption is to miss the profound, science fiction-level terror embedded in the clay. Consider the nature of modern weaponry. We build intercontinental ballistic missiles, nuclear warheads, and autonomous drones. We engineer platforms capable of turning entire continents into glass. Yet, no matter how devastating our modern creations are, they share one comforting limitation. They are dead matter. A nuclear warhead sits in its subterranean silo in complete silence. It does not feel the cold. It does not perceive the passage of years. It possesses no malice, no ambition, and no anxiety. It will wait for 1,000 years for a human hand to turn a key, and if that key is never turned, it will quietly rust into oblivion. But the weapons of the Anunnaki were entirely different. The text makes a horrifying distinction about the nature of Era's arsenal. They are not abstract forces, but rather they have personalities, impatience, they feel time passing, and they intensely want to move. What does it mean for a weapon to feel time passing? Imagine a doomsday machine that is conscious. Imagine a biological agent or a technological drone swarm so advanced, so complex in its neural architecture that it begins to develop an awareness of its own purpose. A weapon's singular purpose is to destroy. If you give that weapon consciousness, its purpose becomes its desire. The text treats these 7 entities as beings that exist entirely independently of will. They are described as weapons so staggeringly powerful that they have developed their own independent desire to be used. This is the detail that forces us to pause and stare into the abyss of the ancient world. The Babylonians were not describing magic. They were describing autonomous, sentient machinery. They were documenting the psychological breakdown of artificial intelligence or bioengineered predators that had been left in storage for too long. These 7 forces are growing increasingly restless. They want to move again, and they demand that Era lead them just the way he once did. They harbor deep, vivid memories of their past deployments, recalling the sheer kinetic thrill of the times when cities burned and the righteous and the wicked died alike without any distinction. There is an overwhelming sense of technological horror in this dynamic. The creator of the world is paralyzed because he has lost his human maintenance crew, but the destroyers of the world are waking up simply because they are bored. They are the ultimate cosmic predators, and they are starving for the friction of war. The dynamic shifts from a story about theology to a story about an advanced civilization losing control of its own apocalyptic technology. Era's advisor, Ishum, recognizes the catastrophic danger of this awakening and keeps trying to quiet them, desperately attempting to keep Era sleeping and to maintain the fragile peace. Ishum is acting as the last rational safeguard, the final line of defense trying to overriding a catastrophic launch sequence that is initiating itself. He knows that if these 7 sentient weapons slip their leashes, the destruction will not be a calculated military strike. It will be a blind, indiscriminate harvest. A weapon that desires to be used does not care about guilt or innocence, righteousness or wickedness. It only cares about the physical act of consumption. This brings us to a terrifying philosophical crossroad. If the Anunnaki were real, biological, or technological entities who once dictated the course of human evolution, what happened when their command structure collapsed? The Era epic paints a picture of a failing empire where the infrastructure of life and creation is breaking down, but the machinery of death is autonomously coming online. When a civilization reaches the absolute peak of its technological capability, it inevitably builds systems designed to outlast its creators. The 7 weapons of Era are exactly that. Fail-safes of annihilation that do not require the Melamu, do not require human temple workers, and do not require the complicated logistical support of the Esagila. They only require a target. The dread that saturated the Babylonian Empire, the reason they wore these clay verses against their skin, was the collective, inherited memory of what happens when gods lose their grip on the very violence they engineered. We must ask ourselves, as we look up at the silent, starry sky, when the architects of the universe finally abandoned their posts, did they take their doomsday machines with them, or did they simply put them to sleep deep within the earth, hoping they would never wake again? To understand why these autonomous machines of destruction were ever activated, we must trace the timeline backward, moving from the fading light of Babylon to the deep, terrifying antiquity recorded in the Atrahasis epic. This ancient Sumerian text, one of the oldest currently preserved within the climate-controlled vaults of the British Museum, forces us to unlearn every comfortable theological narrative we have ever been taught. Modern religions have conditioned us to believe that divine wrath is a righteous response to moral failure, a punishment for sin. We are told that humanity grows wicked, and so the heavens strike back to cleanse the earth. But the oldest written records of human history state clearly that the reason for our near annihilation was entirely devoid of any moral judgment. In the Atrahasis epic, the Anunnaki do not act in a fit of sudden emotional rage. Instead, they operate like a cold, bureaucratic administration, holding 3 separate assemblies to systematically vote on eliminating humanity 3 times before the Great Flood was finally sanctioned. They deployed plague, they deployed drought, and finally, they unleashed the flood itself. And what was our great, unforgivable crime that warranted such repeated, absolute extermination? It was population. It was simply the noise of human civilization that had grown beyond what the Anunnaki could tolerate. Think about the profound, chilling implications of that specific word. Noise. They did not view us as fallen angels or corrupted souls who needed to be redeemed. They viewed us as an invasive species, an infestation of biological machinery that had multiplied out of control and was disrupting the quiet of their planetary estate. They acted with the detached clinical efficiency of an exterminator called to clear out a pest problem that was threatening the structural integrity of the house. Yet, each time the divine assembly voted for our extinction, one entity consistently dissented and stood against the consensus. Each time, the god Enki found a way to circumvent the absolute decision of the assembly, stepping into the shadows to warn one human family and ensure the survival of the species. But this survival came with a terrifying price, a negotiated settlement that was written directly into our biology. After the floodwaters receded and the earth was left a ruined wasteland, Enki negotiated a compromise with the surviving Anunnaki. If humanity was to be allowed to continue existing to serve as the necessary labor force that maintained the gods, they could no longer be allowed to multiply unchecked and threaten the peace of the masters. Biological limits were permanently built into humans. The ancient texts describe this not as a natural evolutionary shift, but as a deliberate, engineered genetic downgrade. We were given a shorter lifespan. We were programmed with a systemic susceptibility to disease, and the devastating tragedy of infant mortality was introduced into the human condition. We were redesigned to be useful enough to keep as a labor force, but explicitly limited, weakened, and shortened, so that we could never become powerful enough to challenge our creators. The divine assembly accepts this brutal biological patch, and then, slowly, an undeniable shift occurs in the historical record. If you lay out the clay tablets of Mesopotamia in chronological order, tracing the progression from the earliest Sumerian cities to the late Babylonian Empire, you can witness the psychological withdrawal of an entire pantheon playing out in real time. Gradually, the very texture of the tablets changes. The gods simply stop walking among humans. In the older records, The divine entities are vividly described as giving face-to-face commands, walking through city streets, and physically deploying their terrible weapons from the sky. But as the centuries pass, these direct interventions thin out across the generations, and then, chillingly, they stop completely. The physical presence fades into shadows. The entities move away from direct physical contact and instead retreat into the abstract, ambiguous realms of oracles and dreams. The later tablets no longer describe towering figures organizing the world or giving explicit instructions. Instead, they describe signs, omens, prophecies, and an overwhelming, expanding distance. The priests are left desperately trying to decipher the flight of birds or the livers of sheep, looking for any trace of the masters who used to walk right beside them. And after the distance comes the silence. By the time the era epic is written in the 8th century BCE, it is not functioning as a prophecy predicting something terrible that is about to happen in the future. It is a historical autopsy explaining something that has already happened. It is the last document that tried to explain why the gods vanished, the final attempt to articulate what the cosmic withdrawal actually looked like from the inside. The terrible weapons went quiet. The divine garments, that radiating physical melamu, deteriorated completely. The age of direct divine presence in the world ended. We are left standing on a planetary scale, a downgraded species engineered for servitude, suddenly realizing that the masters of the house have locked the doors, turned off the lights, and vanished into the dark. The silence the era epic predicted has held absolute for millennia. We look up at the sky, waiting for the return of the architects, but the heavens remain empty, leaving us alone with the haunting realization that they did not ascend to a higher spiritual plane. They simply ran out of power and faded away. Let us pull away from the suffocating, sun-baked clay of the Mesopotamian plains and travel forward into a radically different landscape, moving from the mythological shadows of antiquity directly into the freezing, sterile light of modern scientific revelation. It is easy to dismiss the ancient Babylonian records as the panicked poetry of a dying empire. It is comforting to tell ourselves that the Anunnaki, the Melamu, and the terrifying autonomous weapons were nothing more than the psychological coping mechanisms of early humans trying to make sense of a chaotic world. But in the year 2010, the boundaries between ancient mythology and empirical science violently ruptured. Deep within the Altai Mountains of Siberia, inside the freezing subterranean quiet of the Denisova Cave, geneticists did not uncover a crashed extraterrestrial vessel or the ruins of a golden temple. They found something infinitely smaller, yet vastly more devastating to our understanding of human history. They found a single, fragmented piece of a finger bone. It belonged to a young female, resting in the dirt, waiting out the millennia in complete silence. When scientists extracted the DNA from this microscopic fragment and sequenced it, expecting to find the familiar markers of a Neanderthal or an early Homo sapiens, the machines spit out an impossible ghost story. The genetic code did not belong to us. It did not belong to the Neanderthals. It belonged to an entirely separate, distinct, and previously unknown species of humanity that had walked the earth alongside our ancestors. They named them the Denisovans. Suddenly, the lonely pedestal upon which modern humanity has placed itself began to crack. We were not alone. We were never alone. The biological reality of the Denisovans forces us to confront a terrifying expansion of our historical peripheral vision. Who were these phantoms of the Ice Age? As more physical evidence slowly emerged, a massive molar in the same Siberian cave, a robust, heavily built jawbone discovered on the breathtaking, breathless altitudes of the Tibetan Plateau. A picture of a formidable species began to take shape. The Denisovans were not merely another fragile evolutionary experiment destined to fail early. The fossil record indicates they were physically distinct, noticeably larger, and incredibly robust, engineered by nature to survive and thrive in some of the most extreme, hostile environments on the planet. They possessed biological adaptations that allowed them to breathe easily in the oxygen-starved air of high altitudes, a genetic armor that allowed them to conquer landscapes where our fragile ancestors would have simply frozen or suffocated to death. They were present across the vast, sweeping expanse of Asia, from the frozen steppes to the towering peaks, dominating the terrain with a quiet, enduring majesty. But it is the sheer scale of their timeline that delivers the most devastating blow to the human ego. We are a deeply arrogant species. We measure our triumphs in centuries and our civilizations in mere millennia. We look back at the roughly 5,000 years of recorded human history, from the first cuneiform scratches in Sumerian mud to the towering glass monoliths of our modern cities, and we crown ourselves the undisputed apex of planetary evolution. We assume we are the main characters of the Earth's story, but the Denisovan jawbone found on the Tibetan Plateau was conclusively dated to 160,000 years ago. Let that unfathomable number sink into your marrow. 160,000 years. That means this larger, vastly capable species was present on this planet, hunting, walking, establishing their dominion, and experiencing the world for at least 32 times the duration of our entire modern civilization. If planetary ownership is determined by the sheer duration of occupancy, then this world did not belong to us. It belonged to them. We are merely the late arrivals, the loud, chaotic guests who wandered into a massive, ancient estate that had been occupied for eons by giants. The Denisovans watched the ice ages come and go. They watched the stars shift in the sky. They possessed a staggering biological longevity that makes the entire history of the Babylonian Empire look like a brief, insignificant flash of lightning in a long, dark night. And yet they vanished. A species that held the earth for hundreds of thousands of years simply faded from the board. But the most unsettling truth revealed by the geneticists in 2010 is that the Denisovans did not evaporate entirely into the ether. They did not leave behind giant stone monuments or clay tablets detailing their decline, but they left a record far more intimate and indestructible. They interbred with our ancestors. As Homo sapiens migrated out of Africa and encountered these ancient, imposing beings across the Asian continent, the two species merged in the dark. The Denisovans passed their genes into the human bloodstream. Their DNA is written right now into the biological architecture of modern human populations. The genetic adaptations that allow modern Tibetans to survive at high altitudes are a direct biological inheritance from the Denisovans. The ghosts of this forgotten apex species are circulating in your veins as you listen to these words. They are not entirely dead. They are quietly haunting our genome, a biological echo of a grander age. When we place this cold, hard genetic data next to the ancient clay tablets of Mesopotamia, a chilling synthesis begins to form. Is it possible that the human mind, in its infancy, lacked the scientific vocabulary to describe a superior, parallel hominin species? When our fragile, newly emerged ancestors looked upon beings who were physically larger, who had mastered the earth for tens of thousands of years before we even learned to build a fire, who possessed a terrifying biological superiority, did we call them gods? The ancient texts speak of the Anunnaki as towering figures who walked among humans, who dictated the terms of survival, who intermingled with mortal women, and who eventually, inexplicably, began to withdraw as their power failed. We have spent centuries looking to the stars for the Anunnaki, assuming they were extraterrestrial architects arriving in ships of fire. But what if the profound, terrifying truth is that they were right here beside us the entire time? What if the gods were an ancient, apex branch of our own biological family tree? A species of hominin so established, so enduring, that to a primitive Homo sapiens, they appeared divine. The Denisovans are not a myth. The genetic sequence is a verifiable, peer-reviewed fact. They existed. They were larger. They were here for an eternity. And then they slowly withdrew into the dark, leaving us, the weaker, shorter-lived, hyper-anxious biological machines, to inherit the ruins of their world. As we stare into the genetic code, we must ask ourselves what terrifies us more: the idea that ancient gods abandoned us, or the biological certainty that a human species vastly more powerful and enduring than our own was quietly erased by the brutal, indifferent mechanics of time? We stand at a terrifying intersection where the mythology of a dead empire and the genetic data of modern science suddenly overlap. To see the full picture, we must perform a brutal comparison of timelines. Modern human civilization, as we define it, the building of cities, the writing of laws, the forging of empires, is roughly 5,000 years old. That is the entirety of our collective memory. Everything from the rise of Sumer to the digital age fits into that microscopic window. Now, turn back to the Denisovans. The fossil record proves they existed, walked this earth, and adapted to its harshest environments for at least 160,000 years. They had 32 times the duration on Earth before they vanished. We are a biological flash in the pan compared to the vast, enduring reality of their existence. When you place the clay tablets of the Era epic beside the genetic sequencing of the Denisovan genome, a narrative emerges that defies everything we have been taught. The Babylonian text describes the Anunnaki, beings of absolute power, towering authority, and terrifying technology, slowly withdrawing from the world as their strength failed. The fossil record describes a distinct hominin species, larger and more robust than modern humans, going extinct in the same broad, ancient window. Both records, the mythological and the biological, end the exact same way. The giants disappear, and the fragile humans remain. The Era epic, copied obsessively and worn as armor by a civilization desperate for answers, was not describing the future when it was written. It was not a prophecy of an impending apocalypse. It was an autopsy of an apocalypse that had already happened. It described a changing of the guard, that had already taken place long before the first brick of Babylon was ever laid. And it ended with the only statement that has proven verifiable across the long, brutal centuries that followed. We outlasted them. But why did we survive when the Titans fell? It was not because we defeated them. We did not rise up in a grand biological rebellion and cast down our creators. We were not stronger, we were not smarter, and we were certainly not better equipped to survive the Ice Ages. The Atrahasis epic explicitly states that we were built to serve, shortened in lifespan, limited in physical capacity, and deliberately designed to be useful enough to keep, but not powerful enough to challenge the natural order. We were the biological equivalent of disposable tools. And yet, here we are, 8 billion of us, swarming the planet, building our own towering monuments, long after the beings who designed those very limits have faded into the dust. The Anunnaki made something that outlasted them, and the last thing they left in writing was a quiet, devastating confirmation that they knew exactly how the story would end. To fully comprehend the sheer, staggering weight of this cosmic resignation, we must place ourselves in the quiet, suffocating darkness of a Babylonian room in the 8th century BCE, standing beside the bed of a scribe as he wakes from a nightmare that will outlast his empire. The author of the Era epic, a man named Kabdani Marduk, states in the closing lines that the god Era revealed this text to him in a dream. We are accustomed to the claims of ancient prophets receiving divine visions, but those visions traditionally consist of glorious commandments, blueprints for towering temples, or absolute assurances of eternal divine protection. This man woke up in the dark with a fundamentally different, deeply traumatic burden placed upon his chest. He is the only ancient author to claim divine dictation for a poem that ends with the gods withdrawing permanently. Imagine the psychological terror of that moment. You are a citizen of the greatest empire on the earth, raised to believe that the heavens are governed by absolute, immortal sovereigns. And yet, a god told him to write down the story of divine power failing. It is a terrifying inversion of the natural order. A divine entity bypassed the grand public rituals of the Esagila temple, and instead whispered into the mind of a single, fragile mortal, confessing that the machinery of the heavens was shutting down. And the god told him how the story ends with us still standing. When we examine the vast, sprawling archive of global mythology, a distinct, unbreakable pattern emerges. Ancient religious texts do not end with humans. They end with gods. Whether you look at the Book of Revelation, the Egyptian Book of the Dead, or the Norse sagas, the ultimate conclusion of the cosmic narrative is always a triumphant return to absolute celestial authority. The story concludes with divine promises, divine warnings, divine authority reasserted. The god speaks, the humans listen, the divine order is restored. Humanity is consistently relegated to the role of an audience, a subservient flock waiting to be judged, rescued, or destroyed by the overwhelming majesty of their creators. But this specific clay manuscript fractures that universal template. The Era epic ends differently. After Era withdraws, after the weapons fall silent, the epilogue makes its statements. It does not promise a glorious return or a future paradise. Instead, it says the great gods are returning to their resting places. Notice the chilling finality of that phrase. A resting place is not a throne. It is a tomb, a state of permanent hibernation, a quiet admission that the fuel has finally run out, and that the age of their active presence in the world is over. But it is the very next line that solidifies this text as the most unsettling document of the ancient world. The manuscript declares that after they are gone, not if, after, the humans will remain. The authors do not describe this survival as a glorious victory or a spiritual reward. The humans are left not guided, not judged, not taken somewhere, just remaining as a fact, as the natural outcome of what the poem just described. It is the ultimate cosmic abandonment. The Anunnaki left one sentence in their most copied text describing the world after they're gone. Humans still here. Feel the profound, agonizing weight of a powerful being watching his own power decline. They were the master architects of reality, entities whose physical radiation could paralyze a mortal, who held the capability to scour the planet with autonomous weapons. And yet, they were lucid enough to understand that their biological or technological expiration date had arrived. They were making sure the record of that decline survived. They were making sure someone found it, and making sure the last line of that record said the humans will remain. It forces us to confront the bitter, ultimate irony of our own biological existence. The Atrahasis says explicitly that we were built to serve, shortened, limited, designed to be useful enough to keep, but not powerful enough to challenge. We were intentionally engineered to be the weakest link in the chain, stripped of longevity, plagued by disease, and bound to the dirt. Yet, in the grand, unforgiving calculus of survival, it was precisely those engineered weaknesses that became our greatest strength. The Anunnaki, the Denisovans, the towering giants of antiquity, whatever you wish to call them, were too grand, too complex, requiring massive logistical frameworks and the constant draining labor of lesser beings just to maintain their overwhelming power. Like apex predators that require an unsustainable amount of calories to survive, when the ecosystem of their empire collapsed, they starved and faded into the dark. But humans? We were designed to survive on scraps. We were built to endure suffering, to multiply in the mud, to adapt to the freezing cold and the burning sun without the need for a divine Melamu. The supreme beings built a fragile tool, and the tool outlived the master. And yet here we are, 8 billion of us, long after the beings who designed those limits are gone. We are the abandoned machinery of a dead empire, mindlessly continuing to operate and multiply in a factory where all the managers have turned to dust. This brings us back to the chilling reality of those ancient Babylonians, walking through the dusty streets of their sprawling cities. Why did they carve this terrible confession into clay amulets? Why did they bind the story of the fading gods tightly against their chests, letting it rest against their beating hearts? They wore it because they understood the profound truth hidden within the despair. The Anunnaki described their own extinction in the most reproduced text they ever inspired. It was not a message of hope, but a shield of undeniable reality, a reminder that the heavens may empty, the cosmic radiation may cool, and the grand architects may fall into an eternal slumber, but the creatures forged from the mud will endure the silence. And they ended it with a single quiet statement about what outlasts them. S. As you walk out into the modern world today, surrounded by the towering glass and steel monuments of our own making, look up at the empty sky and ask yourself, what will we leave behind when our own power inevitably begins to fade? And what unimaginable thing might be quietly waiting in the shadows, ready to outlast us?